That's Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem as stalled trade talks and ongoing U.S. tariffs continue to impact key Canadian sectors. On that note, Prime Minister Mark Carney will be meeting virtually with premiers on Thursday with the plan to grow the domestic economy a primary focus. Just before that meeting, the Feds announced their Buy Canadian policy takes effect today. As part of the strategy, Canadian suppliers and content will now be prioritized in government procurement, starting immediately for contracts over $25 million and contracts over $5 million starting in the spring. Additionally, starting right now for construction and defense projects over $25 million, the Feds will require the use of Canadian-produced steel, aluminum, and wood products where available in any project that requires more than $250,000 of product. Joël Lightbound is the minister in charge of all of this. He's the Minister of Procurement. Hi, Minister. Pleasure to welcome you back to our program. Thank you so much for making the time.
Pleasure to be here.
I listened to the way both yourself, Minister, and the Prime Minister have described the potential impact of these policies. We will be our own best customer, creating new orders, more business, and new careers in our industries across the country. And I wanted to start off by putting to you, are these policies really going to have the magnitude of impact that your government is describing? I look, for example, to a study from the Bank of Montreal that says that 91% of procurement contracts inked since mid-2023 were to businesses that already have a Canadian address. Does that not suggest a much more limited scope of impact?
Well, I think you've just put the finger on one of the problems we're trying to solve, is that a business address is not sufficient under this new Buy Canadian policy to qualify as a Canadian supplier. What we're looking for is meaningful economic activity and Canadian content as we evaluate contracts and bids for federal contracts.
And how will you define that?
So yes, yeah, so basically the first thing is we're changing the definition of a Canadian supplier, so just an address will not be sufficient. You can't just be a distributor. You need to have a meaningful economic activity here in Canada. But we're also giving more points to Canadian content, and I think that's the big difference from the number you've just mentioned, where, yes, 91% of Canadian suppliers, but those Canadians can be resellers of foreign-made goods. So what we're looking for are Canadian-made IP, research and development, Canadian-made content, as well as Canadian material, as I've announced today, with aluminum, lumber, and wood products, as well as steel.
Do you know the difference to be discernible? And by that I mean, are you sure that a lot of those addresses that are supplied are not reflective, let's say, of meaningful Canadian content? And now that the changes that you are describing will make a discernible difference?
Yep.
Are you sure?
Well, I'm convinced that it will, and one way we're going to proceed is we're going to ask vendors, so suppliers, where are the goods manufactured, where are they designed. So they're going to have to come up with a roadmap of how certain goods or services they're offering the Canadian government have been produced so as to have the most impact in communities. And when you look at the federal government spent on goods and services in the last year was $67 billion. We're applying it to crown corporations, but also to grants and contributions to provinces, which, all in all, when you look public procurement at public procurements across the country, it represents about 13 to 14% of GDP. So we're hoping to send a clear message that, you know, we're going to have a clear preference for Canadian suppliers, for Canadian content, and this tends also to attract foreign investment so as to have companies invest to produce more here at home and create better jobs here, good jobs in Canada, and foster a resilient Canadian economy.
Are you sure that it's going to do the latter? And I ask because it seems to me like the government is trying to sell two messages. We still stand behind the concept of free trade, but we have to take, and we are taking, this very protectionist turn in light of what the United States is doing. Can you really land both of those messages at the same time?
Well, if you look at the policy I've announced today in detail, I think it's a balanced approach. We've highlighted 5 strategic sectors. So defense is one, construction, industrial goods, health and pharmaceuticals, and we're looking at these sectors to try to foster our industrial base here in Canada. And I think at the same time, we're still open to foreign companies bidding on federal contracts. However, they'll need to demonstrate that they have more Canadian content in order to be competitive, and that's a decision that we're making as a government to bolster our supply chains as well and help our economy.
You mentioned, Minister, certain sectors, right? And I think Canadians are well familiar now with the ones which remain very tariff-laden vis-a-vis the United States and President Trump. I wonder if you could expand on, again, how sure you are that this will have a mitigating impact on the damage that they're feeling. And I'll point to, for example, a comment from the Forest Products Association of Canada, who said there's an incremental opportunity to sell more lumber in Canada if home construction picks up and building codes are changed. But when he quantified it, he said that would likely amount to 1 to 4 billion board feet in additional Canadian sales, compared to around 13 billion that's sent to the United States. Can we really give ourselves what the U.S. has taken away? Because it seems like the numbers don't support that thesis that your government is putting forward.
But as far as the Buy Canadian policy, of course, it will impact different sectors differently. But when you look at the major projects where we've got in the pipeline, when you think at high-speed rail, for instance, defense procurements, the major projects in terms of critical minerals, the construction, the infrastructure, the housing, the message we're sending is that in order to be competitive for federal contracts, you'll need to be sourcing your materials where available from Canadian suppliers and Canadian materials. So, of course, it's going to be incremental. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think that message needs to be sent, and the policy is taking effect today. And from our perspective, and from what I've heard from many businesses across the country, I keep hearing a contract is much better than a grant. So we're looking at giving more contracts to Canadian suppliers, more contracts for Canadian content, which tends also to be a good business card around the world when you've got a contract from the Government of Canada. And it's something that is well supported within the population because they see the benefits. And on that end, you know, when we evaluate bids at the federal level, there's the price, but there's the value. And the value is also the jobs created here in Canada and how it's helped our economic resilience.
And I certainly understand all those points, and I most understand the point around sending a signal and delivering a message. But ultimately, Canadians will want to see results. And when you describe them as potentially incremental, that this will take a very long time to materialize and benefit those sectors or benefit Canadians, that is not exactly what the Prime Minister is saying, right? Again, the quote that I use, we'll be our own best customer, creating new orders, more business, new careers in our industries across the country. I mean, the Prime Minister has explicitly on multiple occasions said, we are going to give ourselves, and we can give ourselves, what the United States has taken away. Would we not be more elbows up against the U.S. if that in fact were true?
But I think this policy definitely will help build the resilience of the Canadian economy, but we have to look at the agenda of the government as a whole, where our focus is on being more productive, helping industries in various sectors and those most affected by tariffs for sure, innovate, be more competitive, and also have access to different markets, which is exactly what we've done and what is presented in Budget 2025. But I think this is an essential step that the Canadian government start looking not just at Canadian suppliers from the previous definition, which would allow for, you know, just a distributor here selling foreign-made products to qualify as a Canadian supplier, but really to look at the content, and we'll assess the results over time. But the scale of procurement and the scale of procurement in years to come as we invest more in defense and infrastructure, I think will help leverage those procurement to be a factor of economic development in this country, which hasn't always been the case.
And again, I do, Minister, with great respect, understand the message that you're trying to deliver, but Canadians are focused on results because that's what the Prime Minister has said he wants your government to be focused on, and that 100%. Canadians in turn should be focused on. Do you understand concern that Canadians might have, or a lack of trust that your government can execute on this plan? This basically forms an industrial policy. The last industrial policy the Liberals pursued was one around electric vehicles, and that has effectively turned into a disaster.
Well, I look at the scale of what I've announced today, which is massive in terms of the change in direction the government is taking in order to implement Buy Canadian, but also applying it to Crown Corporation, to grants and contributions. That is substantial. And the number I've highlighted in the beginning of this interview, 13% of GDP is public procurement, so public markets across the country. That's a very big number. It's a lot of potential jobs and opportunities for Canadian businesses, and I think it's the right step at the right time.
I will leave it on that note. Minister, a pleasure as always. Thank you for making the time.
It's been a pleasure. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
Yeah, happy holidays and Merry Christmas to you as well.